In the summer of 1945, three men sat around a table in a ruined German suburb called Potsdam. The war that had killed 60 million people was finally ending. These men, an American president who'd been in office barely 3 months, a British prime minister who would lose his job before the conference ended, and a Soviet dictator who trusted no one, were about to divide the world. They didn't know it yet. They thought they were discussing borders and reparations, the ordinary business of ending a war. But something else was happening beneath the surface of their polite disagreements. Two ways of organizing human society, two visions of what freedom meant, two systems that could not coexist were about to lock themselves into a struggle that would shape everything. For the next 45 years, this struggle would determine which governments rose and fell across 6 continents. It would put nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert minutes from ending civilization. It would fund dictators and freedom fighters, sometimes the same people. It would reach into your grandmother's kitchen and your grandfather's workplace, shaping what they could say, what they could think, what they could dream. And when it ended, suddenly, unexpectedly, on a November night in Berlin in 1989, it didn't really end at all. The Cold War's children still run the world. Its assumptions still shape our politics. Its fears still echo in every debate about democracy and authoritarianism, about markets and equality, about what America owes the world and what the world owes itself. Before we begin this journey through the conflict that made our world, a gentle note. If these calm explorations of history help you unwind at the end of your day, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always interested in your reflections. Let us know in the comments which moments from the Cold War still echo in your own life, or which historical turning points you'd like us to explore next. Now, as the day winds down and the noise of the present fades, let us travel back to understand the shadow that still falls across our politics. This is not a story of heroes and villains, though it has both. It is a story of fear, and what fear makes people do. This is the bedtime history of how the Cold War shaped modern politics. The bomb changed everything. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a single blinding flash over the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the mushroom cloud rise, quoted Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He wasn't being dramatic, he was being precise. 3 weeks later, that same fire consumed Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered, and the bloodiest war in human history ended with a weapon that made all previous wars obsolete. The men who had built it understood immediately what they had done. They had not simply created a bigger bomb, they had created a device that could end human civilization in an afternoon. The Soviets understood too. Stalin received the news at Potsdam, his face carefully blank. Truman thought he hadn't grasped the significance. Truman was wrong. Stalin grasped it perfectly. He simply refused to give Truman the satisfaction of seeing his alarm. That night, Stalin called Moscow. The Soviet nuclear program, already underway, became the regime's highest priority. The race was on. But the nuclear standoff was only the most dramatic expression of something deeper. 2 empires had emerged from the war's wreckage, and they were built on incompatible foundations. The American vision was straightforward, at least in theory. Free markets, free elections, free trade. A world where goods and ideas crossed borders easily, where international institutions prevented the chaos that had led to 2 world wars. This was not pure altruism. American industry needed markets, and American security required stable allies. But the vision was genuine. Roosevelt had died believing the United Nations could prevent future conflicts. Truman inherited that hope, even as events conspired against it. The Soviet vision was equally coherent, equally sincere in its way. Stalin had watched 27 million of his people die because the capitalist powers had tolerated fascism, had even hoped Hitler would destroy the communist experiment. Never again. The Soviet Union would have a buffer zone of friendly states on its western border. The Eastern European nations that had served as invasion corridors for Napoleon and Hitler would become socialist allies. This was not mere imperialism, though it was certainly that too. It was the logic of survival learned at terrible cost. The problem was geography. The buffer zone Stalin needed was the Eastern Europe that American policymakers believed should choose its own destiny. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, these nations had been promised free elections. Churchill and Roosevelt had extracted that commitment at Yalta in February 1945. Stalin had signed the Declaration on Liberated Europe. Then he ignored it entirely.
The speed of the transformation was breathtaking. In Poland, the Soviet-backed government arrested opposition leaders, rigged elections, and crushed any independent organization. In Romania, a Soviet deputy minister literally dictated cabinet appointments to the king. In Bulgaria, opposition politicians were tried and executed. Each country followed the same pattern: coalition government, then communist dominance, then one-party rule. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would call it in 1946, descended across the continent. American diplomats watched in growing alarm. George Kennan, a young Foreign Service officer in Moscow, sent an 8,000-word telegram explaining what was happening. The Soviet leadership, he argued, was driven by a fundamental insecurity. They could not believe in permanent peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world. They would probe constantly for weakness, expanding wherever they could. The only response was patient, long-term containment, blocking Soviet expansion without provoking direct war. Kennan's long telegram reached Washington in February 1946. It crystallized what many already felt. The wartime alliance was over. A new kind of conflict was beginning, not a war with battles and front lines, but a contest of systems, ideas, and willpower that might last decades. The word cold attached itself to this war almost immediately. Bernard Baruch used it publicly in 1947. Walter Lippmann made it famous. The adjective captured something essential. This was war without combat between the main adversaries. War conducted through proxies and pressure and propaganda. War that was always threatening to become hot, but never quite did, because both sides knew what nuclear weapons meant. In March 1947, President Truman stood before Congress to request aid for Greece and Turkey. Communist insurgents were threatening the Greek government. Soviet pressure was squeezing Turkey. Britain, exhausted and bankrupt from the war, could no longer maintain its traditional role in the Eastern Mediterranean. Someone had to step in. Truman's speech went far beyond Greece and Turkey. He announced a doctrine that would define American foreign policy for generations. The United States, he declared, would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. Wherever communism threatened, America would respond. The language was universal, even messianic. The implications were staggering. 3 months later came the Marshall Plan. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed massive American aid to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. The offer was extended to Eastern Europe too, a strategic masterstroke that forced Stalin to reveal his hand. He forbade his satellites from accepting. Czechoslovakia's government wanted to participate. Soviet pressure forced them to refuse. The division of Europe became permanent. The Marshall Plan worked beyond anyone's expectations. Western Europe rebuilt with remarkable speed. The contrast with the Soviet zone became visible, tangible, undeniable. West Germans were buying radios while East Germans queued for bread. The economic miracle was also an ideological argument made in steel and concrete and rising living standards.
But the Cold War was never simply about Europe. It was global from the start, and nowhere more dramatically than in China. The Chinese Civil War had paused during the Japanese invasion. Now it resumed with terrible intensity. Mao Zedong's communist forces, hardened by years of guerrilla fighting, swept across the countryside. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, corrupt and demoralized, collapsed faster than anyone expected. By October 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square, proclaiming the People's Republic. The world's most populous nation had gone communist. In America, the reaction bordered on hysteria. Who lost China? The question implied that China had been America's to lose, a revealing assumption. Congressional investigations hunted for traitors in the State Department. Careers were destroyed. The search for scapegoats would shape American politics for decades. Then came Korea. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, invading the South. Stalin had approved the attack, believing America would not respond. He was wrong. Truman committed American troops under United Nations authority. The Cold War had turned hot. The Korean fighting would kill over 2 million people. It would establish the template for Cold War conflicts: limited war, fought through proxies, never quite escalating to direct superpower confrontation, but always threatening to. MacArthur wanted to bomb China, perhaps use nuclear weapons. Truman fired him, preserving the crucial distinction between Cold and Hot War. The armistice in 1953 left the peninsula divided, as it remains today. By the early 1950s, the architecture of the Cold War world was set. NATO bound Western Europe to American military power. The Soviet bloc operated under Moscow's direction. Both sides developed hydrogen bombs, 1,000 times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima. Both sides built bombers, then missiles, then submarines that could destroy the other cities in minutes. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction emerged from this reality. MAD, they called it, with dark humor. Neither side could win a nuclear war. Any attack would guarantee retaliation that would destroy the attacker. The only winning move was not to play. This terrible logic kept the peace, if peace is the right word for a condition of permanent terror. In America, school children practiced hiding under their desks. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. Civil defense films explained what to do when the flash came. The bomb entered the collective unconscious, shaping art and literature and dreams. We lived, as one philosopher put it, under a permanent, suspended death sentence. But life went on. The economy boomed, suburbs spread, television brought the world into living rooms. The contradiction defined the era: profound anxiety coexisting with unprecedented prosperity, existential dread alongside backyard barbecues and station wagons. Americans learned to live with the bomb, to put it out of mind most days, to trust that the men in charge would keep the missiles in their silos. They were right to trust, mostly, but there were moments, more than the public knew, when civilization balanced on the edge. Men made decisions under pressure that could have ended everything. Radar showed phantom attacks, communication systems failed, submarines surfaced with authorization to launch. Each time, someone hesitated, doubted, refused to press the button. We are here because of those hesitations.
As you settle deeper into your pillow, consider this. The world we inherited was shaped by men who possessed weapons they couldn't fully control, making decisions they couldn't fully understand, in situations where a single mistake meant extinction. They were not wiser than us, not more rational, not less prone to fear and anger and miscalculation. Yet here we are. The Cold War's first decade established patterns that would persist for 45 years. The division of Europe, the globalization of conflict, the nuclear standoff, the ideological intensity that turned every local dispute into a proxy for the larger struggle. These patterns are still with us, in different forms, with different players. But the Cold War was not only about states and missiles. It was about ideas, about what people believed and why they believed it. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the struggle for hearts and minds shaped culture, art, and the very concept of freedom, and how both superpowers discovered that ideas are harder to control than armies. For now, let the tensions of 1945 fade into the distance. The men at Potsdam are long gone. The bombs they built still exist, but the fingers on the triggers have changed. Sleep is possible, even in a world that once seemed determined to destroy itself. Rest now. The story continues tomorrow. The real war was invisible. It moved through radio waves and printed pages, through jazz recordings smuggled across borders and ballet dancers defecting at airports.
It happened in the minds of factory workers in Milan and students in Jakarta and farmers in Guatemala. Both superpowers understood something that generals often forget. You cannot occupy a mind with tanks. You have to fill it with something else. The Soviets had a word for it: agitprop. Agitation and propaganda fused into a single weapon. They had been refining these techniques since 1917, when a small band of revolutionaries had somehow convinced a vast empire to tear itself apart. Lenin understood that ideas were more dangerous than bullets. Stalin understood that controlling information meant controlling reality itself. The Soviet system produced propaganda the way Detroit produced automobiles, efficiently, relentlessly, at industrial scale. But the Americans had weapons of their own. They had Hollywood, they had jazz, they had the simple, intoxicating image of abundance, refrigerators and automobiles and supermarkets overflowing with goods. They had the promise, however imperfectly fulfilled, of individual freedom. And they had something the Soviets could never match: the appeal of not being told what to think. The Cultural Cold War began before anyone named it. It began with books and radio broadcasts, with exchange programs and international exhibitions. It would eventually encompass everything from abstract painting to rock and roll, from literary magazines to the Olympic Games. Nothing was innocent. Everything was a front. The Central Intelligence Agency was barely 2 years old when it discovered culture. In 1949, a group of intellectuals gathered in Berlin, the divided city that had become the Cold War's symbolic center, for something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The timing was deliberate. The Berlin blockade had just ended. Soviet tanks had crushed opposition across Eastern Europe. Western intellectuals, many of them former Marxists disillusioned by Stalin's crimes, wanted to fight back with ideas. What they didn't know, at least not all of them, was who was paying the bills. The CIA funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom for nearly 2 decades. They funded literary magazines across Europe and Latin America: Encounter in London, Proofs in Paris, Cuadernos in Latin America. They funded art exhibitions, symphony tours, international conferences. They subsidized translations of George Orwell and funded abstract expressionist painters whose works seemed to embody the freedom the West claimed to represent. The money flowed through a labyrinth of foundations and front organizations. Some participants knew the source, many did not. When the revelations came in 1966 and 1967, the scandal was immense. But by then, the Cultural Cold War had achieved something remarkable. It had convinced much of the world's intelligentsia that the Soviet model was not just politically repressive, but culturally dead. The irony was exquisite. The CIA, that most secretive of organizations, had become a patron of the arts. Spies who spent their days plotting coups were also deciding which literary magazines deserved funding. The agency that would later be exposed for assassination plots and torture programs had simultaneously been supporting poetry journals and modern dance. This was the Cold War's peculiar genius. It could contain multitudes. It could sponsor both death squads and Dostoevsky translations, both covert operations and overt celebrations of freedom. The contradiction never resolved itself. It simply persisted, year after year, as both sides insisted they represented civilization against barbarism. Radio was the first front. The Voice of America had broadcast during World War II. Now it became a weapon aimed at the Soviet bloc. Radio Free Europe targeted Eastern Europe specifically, staffed largely by exiles who knew the languages and the cultures, who could speak to Poles and Hungarians and Czechs in their own idioms about what their governments were hiding. The Soviets jammed the signals. They poured resources into drowning out the foreign voices with static and noise. But the jamming was never complete. Late at night, when atmospheric conditions were right, the broadcasts got through. People gathered around shortwave radios in kitchens and basements, listening to news their governments didn't want them to hear. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Simply knowing that another world existed, that the official version of reality was not the only version, created mental space for dissent. The broadcasts didn't need to convert listeners to capitalism, they just needed to crack the monopoly on truth. Once that crack existed, doubt could seep in, and doubt in a system built on certainty was corrosive.
The Soviets responded with their own broadcasts. Radio Moscow reached around the world in dozens of languages, explaining the achievements of socialism and the crimes of imperialism. They found receptive audiences in the colonized world, among people who had experienced Western capitalism not as freedom but as exploitation. The Cold War's propaganda battle was never simply a contest between truth and lies. It was a contest between different truths, different emphases, different silences. Each side told genuine stories about the other's failures. The Americans broadcast about the Gulag, about political prisoners, about the crushing of dissent. The Soviets broadcast about segregation, about lynchings, about the treatment of Native Americans. Both were telling the truth. Both were lying by omission. The listeners had to decide which omissions mattered more. The competition extended into every corner of culture. The Soviets poured resources into their ballet companies and symphony orchestras, showcasing the achievements of socialist culture. When the Bolshoi toured the West, audiences gasped at the technical perfection. When Soviet pianists won international competitions, it was front-page news in Pravda. Culture was proof that socialism could produce excellence, not just tractors and missiles. The Americans countered with jazz. The State Department sent Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie and Duke Ellington on tours of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Jazz was perfect propaganda, genuinely American, undeniably brilliant, and created largely by black musicians in a country still practicing segregation. The contradiction was obvious and awkward, but the music transcended it somehow. Jazz spoke of improvisation, of individual expression, of freedom within structure. It was democracy made audible. The tours were not without tension. Armstrong initially refused to go to the Soviet Union, pointing out the hypocrisy of representing American freedom while black children in Little Rock needed federal troops to attend school. "The way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell," he told reporters. Eventually, he went. The music did its work regardless of the musicians' complicated feelings. The Soviets had their own musical weapons. Classical music, of course, but also the songs of revolution, the Internationale, the anthems of liberation movements around the world. They supported folk festivals and youth choirs and competitions designed to showcase the vitality of socialist culture. When the World Festival of Youth and Students convened in Moscow in 1957, 34,000 young people from around the world gathered to celebrate peace and socialism. It was propaganda, certainly, but it was also genuine community, genuine idealism, genuine hope. The battle reached into the world of ideas with particular intensity. Marxism was not merely an economic theory, it was a comprehensive worldview that claimed to explain history, society, culture, even human consciousness. Western intellectuals had to respond with equally comprehensive alternatives. This produced strange bedfellows. The CIA found itself funding existentialists and abstract expressionists, thinkers whose work had nothing obvious to do with anti-communism. But the logic was clear enough. Any cultural movement that emphasized individual freedom, that resisted systematic explanation, that celebrated ambiguity and choice, all of this implicitly challenged the Marxist claim to have decoded history's laws. Abstract expressionism became an unlikely weapon. Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, Rothko's color fields, Willem de Kooning's violent canvases, these works embodied a freedom of expression impossible under socialist realism. The Museum of Modern Art, with quiet CIA support, organized touring exhibitions that brought American art to Europe and beyond. Art critics who might have sneered at government involvement in aesthetics found themselves unwitting soldiers in a cultural war. The Soviets denounced abstract art as bourgeois decadence, the death rattle of a dying system.
Their own artists were required to produce socialist realism, heroic workers, bountiful harvests, wise leaders. The contrast was stark. One system trusted artists to express themselves, the other told them what to express. At least that was the story. The reality was more complicated. American artists faced their own pressures, their own censorship, their own suspicions during the McCarthy era. But the story was powerful, and stories matter. McCarthyism remains the Cold War's great American shame. The fear that communists had infiltrated the government, the military, Hollywood, the universities, this fear was not entirely irrational. Soviet espionage was real. Alger Hiss was probably guilty. The Rosenbergs did pass nuclear secrets, but the response far exceeded the threat. Senator Joseph McCarthy gave his name to an era of suspicion and accusation. Careers were destroyed on the basis of rumor. Artists were blacklisted for attending the wrong meetings decades earlier. Professors lost their jobs for refusing to sign loyalty oaths. The FBI compiled files on anyone who seemed insufficiently patriotic, which eventually meant almost everyone. The great irony was that McCarthyism undermined the very freedom it claimed to protect. How could America present itself as the land of liberty while jailing people for their beliefs? How could it lecture the Soviets about political repression while maintaining its own blacklists? The contradiction gave Soviet propagandists endless ammunition. Every congressional hearing, every loyalty oath, every ruined career was proof that American freedom was a fraud. The fever broke eventually. McCarthy overreached, attacking the army, and was censured by the Senate in 1954. The blacklists faded, the worst excesses ended, but the damage lingered. A generation of Americans learned that certain ideas were dangerous to express, certain associations career-ending. The chill outlasted the formal repression. Self-censorship, the most effective censorship of all, took root. The Soviets, of course, did everything McCarthy did and worse, on a vastly larger scale. The Gulag swallowed millions. Entire peoples were deported. Dissent meant death or disappearance. There was no comparison in scale, but there was something in kind, the same fear of contamination, the same hunt for hidden enemies, the same willingness to sacrifice individuals to ideological purity. The Cold War made both societies more paranoid, more suspicious, more willing to sacrifice liberty for security. The competition for hearts and minds extended into the emerging nations of Africa and Asia. As European empires collapsed, a process accelerated by the war, dozens of new countries faced a fundamental choice. Which model would they follow? Which superpower would they align with? The Cold War came to them whether they wanted it or not. Both sides wooed the new nations with aid and attention. The Soviets offered an anti-colonial narrative. Capitalism was imperialism, and the West had exploited the developing world for centuries. The Americans offered development assistance and the promise of modernization. Both sides sent advisors, built infrastructure, trained military officers. Both sides looked for allies and punished neutrality. The non-aligned movement tried to chart a third course. India's Nehru, Egypt's Nasser, Indonesia's Sukarno, these leaders refused to choose sides entirely. They took aid from both, played the superpowers against each other, tried to maintain independence in a world that pressured them constantly toward alignment. The 1955 Bandung Conference brought together leaders from 29 African and Asian nations, announcing that the Cold War's binary logic did not apply to them. But neutrality was difficult. The Soviets punished it when they could. They supported coups against leaders who leaned the wrong way. They intervened in civil wars, turning local conflicts into proxy battles. The dream of non-alignment survived, but it was always constrained by the reality of superpower pressure.
Education became another battleground. Both sides invested heavily in bringing foreign students to study in their countries. The Soviets offered scholarships to students from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, training a generation of engineers and doctors and party officials. Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, named for the murdered Congolese leader, educated thousands of Third World students in Marxism-Leninism and technical subjects.
Returned as critics, having experienced American racism and poverty alongside the prosperity. The results were unpredictable, as cultural exchange always is. The Peace Corps, launched by Kennedy in 1961, sent young Americans to live and work in developing countries. The program was idealistic and effective, and also clearly designed to compete with Soviet influence. Volunteers taught English and built schools and dug wells. They also represented an alternative to the Soviet model, young people serving not a party but humanity, not ideology but practical improvement. The line between genuine service and sophisticated propaganda was impossible to draw. By the early 1960s, the Cultural Cold War had achieved a kind of stalemate. Both sides had their victories, their converts, their spheres of influence. Neither had delivered a knockout blow. The world remained divided, but the division was mental as much as political. Two ways of understanding history, two sets of assumptions about human nature, two answers to the question of what made societies prosper. The next phase would be bloodier. The competition that had been fought with books and broadcasts would increasingly be fought with bullets and bombs. The Third World, supposedly liberated from colonial exploitation, would become the primary battlefield, and both superpowers would discover that hearts and minds, once you started trying to control them, had a way of escaping your grasp. As you drift towards sleep, consider what it meant to grow up in a world of permanent ideological warfare. Every movie you watched, every book you read, every song you heard, all of it was positioned somewhere in the great struggle. Neutrality was impossible. Even refusing to choose was a choice, a political statement, a position in the global chess game. We have not escaped this legacy. The instinct to divide the world into good and evil, the suspicion that culture is never innocent, the awareness that information is always weaponized, these are Cold War inheritances. We learned them from our parents and grandparents, who learned them from a world that gave them no alternative. Rest now. In our next chapter, the war turns hot in Korea, in Vietnam, in a dozen countries whose names most Westerners never learned to pronounce. The battle for hearts and minds gives way to the battle for bodies and territory. The cost will be measured in millions of lives. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight, let the radio static fade. Let the dueling broadcasts fall silent. Sleep, if you can, in the space between the signals.
The children were always the first to notice the helicopters. In villages across Vietnam, across Guatemala, across Angola, the sound of rotor blades became the sound of the future arriving, sometimes with medicine and school books, sometimes with fire. The Cold War's great powers rarely fought each other directly. They fought through others, in other people's countries, with other people's blood. This was the terrible arithmetic of the nuclear age. The superpowers could not risk direct confrontation. The missiles in their silos guaranteed that any war between them would be the last war. So they found other places to compete, other bodies to spend. The Third World, that condescending term for most of humanity, became a chessboard where Washington and Moscow moved their pieces. The pieces, of course, were human beings. Between 1945 and 1990, the Cold War killed somewhere between 10 and 20 million people, depending on how you count. Almost none of them were American or Soviet citizens. They were Korean and Vietnamese, Guatemalan and Chilean, Angolan and Afghan. They died in wars that were never really about them, wars where their countries served as arenas for a struggle that began in Potsdam and Berlin. The superpowers called these conflicts limited wars. They were limited only for the superpowers. Tonight, we trace the fire as it spread across the periphery.
We follow it from Korea's frozen mountains to Vietnam's jungles, from the banana plantations of Central America to the diamond mines of Africa. This is not a comfortable story, but it is a necessary one, because the world we live in was forged in these flames. Korea established the template. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, they set in motion the first major proxy war of the nuclear age. Stalin had approved the invasion, believing the Americans would not intervene. Mao had promised Chinese support if needed. The communist bloc was testing the limits of Western resolve. Truman surprised them. Within days, American troops were rushing to Korea under United Nations authority. The Soviet delegate had been boycotting the Security Council, a tactical blunder that allowed the intervention to proceed with international legitimacy. The war that followed would last 3 years and kill over 2 million people. The fighting seesawed across the peninsula. MacArthur's brilliant landing at Incheon reversed the initial North Korean advance. United Nations forces pushed north toward the Chinese border. Then China intervened, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers streaming across the Yalu River. The front collapsed. Seoul fell again. Eventually, the lines stabilized roughly where they had begun, along the 38th parallel. The armistice of 1953 ended the fighting but not the war. No peace treaty was ever signed. American troops remained in South Korea. They are still there today. The peninsula stayed divided, 2 systems facing each other across the most heavily fortified border on Earth. Families were separated for decades. The wound never healed. Korea taught both sides lessons they would apply elsewhere. Limited war was possible in the nuclear age. Proxy conflicts could be fought without triggering Armageddon. But the costs were immense, and victory, real victory, the kind that resolved anything, proved elusive. The template was set: intervention, escalation, stalemate, frozen conflict. It would repeat across the globe.
Vietnam was Korea's darker echo, amplified and extended until it broke something in American society that has never fully mended. The French had been fighting there since 1946, trying to reclaim their colonial possession from Ho Chi Minh's communist-led independence movement. The Americans paid most of the bills. By 1954, Washington was funding 80% of the French war effort. When the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu fell in May 1954, the colonial project collapsed. Vietnam was partitioned, like Korea, into communist North and non-communist South. The South was never stable. A succession of governments, each more corrupt and unpopular than the last, depended on American support for survival. The communist insurgency, the Viet Cong, supplied and directed from Hanoi, grew stronger each year. By the early 1960s, American advisors were already fighting and dying in Vietnamese jungles. The question was not whether to intervene more deeply, but when and how. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 provided the pretext. North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked American destroyers. The details were murky. Later evidence suggested the second attack never happened, but Congress authorized military force. The escalation began. What followed was a decade of devastation. American troop levels rose to over 500,000. B-52s dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than all sides combined had dropped in World War II. Napalm and Agent Orange poisoned the land for generations. Search and destroy missions swept through villages, creating refugees by the millions. The body counts mounted. Always the body counts, the grim mathematics of attrition warfare. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong absorbed everything and kept fighting. They had been at war, in one form or another, since 1941. They were fighting for their country, on their soil, against foreign invaders. Time was on their side. The Americans, for all their firepower, could not stay forever. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 changed everything without changing anything militarily. Communist forces attacked simultaneously across South Vietnam, even penetrating the American embassy compound in Saigon. They were beaten back with heavy losses, but the images, fighting in the embassy, Viet Cong sappers everywhere at once, shattered the official narrative of progress. The American public, told for years that victory was approaching, saw with their own eyes that it was not. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American news, returned from Vietnam and told his audience that the war was unwinnable. Lyndon Johnson, watching the broadcast, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Weeks later, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war had consumed his presidency. Nixon promised peace with honor. What he delivered was 4 more years of fighting, an expansion of the war into Cambodia, and a peace agreement in 1973 that everyone knew would not hold. When Saigon fell in April 1975, the helicopters evacuating Americans from the embassy roof became the war's final image. After all the bombs, all the bodies, all the treasure spent, the communists had won. Vietnam killed 58,000 Americans and somewhere between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese. It divided American society in ways that persist today. It taught a generation to distrust their government and taught their government to distrust them. The wound was so deep that for decades afterward, every proposed military intervention was measured against the specter of another Vietnam. But Vietnam was not the Cold War's only bleeding edge. While Americans were dying in Southeast Asian jungles, their government was also intervening, more quietly but just as consequentially, across Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. The methods varied: coups, assassinations, support for dictators, but the logic was always the same. Every country, every movement, every leader was evaluated through the lens of the superpower struggle. Local concerns meant nothing next to the great global contest.
Latin America had been Washington's backyard since the Monroe Doctrine. The Cold War made it a laboratory for intervention. Guatemala came first. In 1954, the CIA overthrew Jacobo Arbenz, a democratically elected president whose land reforms threatened the United Fruit Company and, more importantly, looked suspiciously socialist to Washington. The coup installed a military dictatorship that would murder over 200,000 people in the decades that followed. The pattern was established: better a friendly dictator than an unfriendly democracy. Cuba broke the pattern. Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 brought communism 90 miles from Florida. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, CIA-trained exiles landing on Cuban beaches, failed catastrophically, humiliating the Kennedy administration. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been or would be again. For 13 days in October, humanity held its breath. Soviet missiles in Cuba capable of reaching Washington in minutes, American warships blockading the island, Khrushchev and Kennedy exchanging ultimatums. At the height of the crisis, a Soviet submarine commander, bombarded with American depth charges and out of radio contact with Moscow, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. He was overruled by another officer. We came that close. The crisis ended with a deal. The Soviets withdrew their missiles, the Americans secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey and promised not to invade Cuba. Both sides stepped back from the abyss, shaken by how close they had come. Afterward, a hotline connected the White House and Kremlin directly. The lesson was learned: miscommunication could end the world. But the lesson applied only to direct confrontation. In the periphery, anything remained possible. Chile elected Salvador Allende in 1970, the first Marxist chosen by free election anywhere. Nixon and Kissinger were determined to prevent his success. "Make the economy scream," Nixon ordered. The CIA poured money into opposition groups, funded strikes, cultivated military officers. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military struck. Allende died in the presidential palace. Suicide, the official story said, though doubts persist. General Augusto Pinochet took power.
What followed was systematic horror. Thousands were killed or disappeared. Tens of thousands were tortured. The National Soccer Stadium became a concentration camp. Economists trained at the University of Chicago, the Chicago Boys, implemented radical free market reforms while the military crushed any dissent. Chile became a laboratory for both authoritarian governance and neoliberal economics. The pattern repeated across the continent. Argentina's dirty war, Brazil's military dictatorship, Operation Condor coordinating repression across borders with American knowledge and support. The Cold War justified everything. Anti-communism sanctified any method, any ally, any body count. The Soviets were no different. Their invasions of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 crushed movements for reform within their own bloc. When the Soviet Afghans seized power in 1978 and promptly began losing control, the Soviets invaded to save them. 10 years of war followed, the Soviet Vietnam, bleeding the Red Army in mountain passes while American-supplied mujahideen picked off their soldiers. The Afghans paid the highest price. Over 1 million died. Millions more became refugees. The country was destroyed, its soil seeded with mines, its society fractured into armed factions that would eventually give rise to the Taliban. The Soviets withdrew in 1989, defeated. They had learned the same lesson the Americans learned in Vietnam. Local resistance supplied by a superpower patron could outlast any occupation.
Africa was carved up differently but just as thoroughly. As European empires retreated, France from Algeria, Belgium from Congo, Portugal from Angola and Mozambique, the Cold War rushed in to fill the vacuum. The Congo was the template for catastrophe. When Patrice Lumumba, the newly independent nation's first prime minister, sought Soviet assistance after the West proved unhelpful, the CIA helped arrange his overthrow and assassination. Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator who eventually emerged, would rule for 32 years, looting billions while his people starved. He was anti-communist, so he was acceptable. Angola's civil war lasted from 1975 to 2002, drawing in Cuban troops, South African forces, American weapons, and Soviet advisors. The fighting killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions more. Similar dynamics played out in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, in Somalia. Local conflicts transformed into proxy wars, their participants supplied with weapons far more sophisticated than their countries could afford. The apartheid regime in South Africa presented particular complications. Its racism was an international embarrassment, but its anti-communism made it useful. The Reagan administration pursued constructive engagement, maintaining ties even as the regime murdered its opponents. The African National Congress, seeking arms wherever it could find them, turned to the Soviet bloc. Nelson Mandela would spend 27 years in prison, classified as a terrorist by governments that funded actual terrorists elsewhere. The Middle East was the most strategically crucial periphery of all. Oil made it so. The Western economy ran on Persian Gulf petroleum, and the Soviets continually probed for influence in the region. Iran had been a Western client since the CIA helped overthrow Mossadegh in 1953. The Shah, restored to power, became a pillar of American strategy, armed to the teeth, brutally repressive, and seemingly permanent. His fall in 1979 stunned Washington. The Islamic Revolution that followed was neither communist nor capitalist, a third force that fit no Cold War category. The hostage crisis that followed, 444 days of humiliation for America, ended the Carter presidency and haunted American policy for decades. Israel became increasingly central to American strategy. The 1967 and 1973 wars drew the superpowers into direct confrontation by proxy. American arms flowed to Israel, Soviet arms to Egypt and Syria. The October 1973 war nearly escalated into something unthinkable. Both superpowers raised their nuclear alert levels. Once again, the brink was approached and pulled back from, but the region remained saturated with weapons and grievances. The consequences echo still.
The CIA's support for Afghan mujahideen contributed to the rise of al-Qaeda. The overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran created resentments that fueled the Islamic Revolution. The weapons shipped to proxy forces scattered across conflict zones, arming generations of fighters. The Cold War created conditions that would produce the next era's conflicts. What do we make of all this blood? The Cold War's defenders argue that it was necessary, that containing Soviet expansion prevented something worse, that the alternative to American intervention was communist tyranny everywhere. There is something to this argument. The Soviet system was genuinely oppressive. Its expansion would not have brought liberation. But the Cold War's critics point to the bodies. They point to the democracies overthrown, the dictators installed, the civilians slaughtered in the name of freedom. They ask whether Guatemala's decades of military rule were really better than Arbenz' land reform. They ask whether the million dead in Indonesia's anti-communist purges of 1965, supported and celebrated by Washington, were an acceptable price. They ask whether any ideological victory could justify what was done. Perhaps the honest answer is that both things are true. The Soviet Union was a genuine threat that required genuine response, and the response often created horrors of its own, horrors that cannot be justified by appeal to the larger struggle. The Cold War was not a contest between good and evil. It was a contest between two flawed powers, each capable of cruelty, each convinced of its own righteousness. The peoples caught between them, the Koreans and Vietnamese, the Guatemalans and Chileans, the Angolans and Afghans, had no say in any of it. They were pieces on a board, moved by players who never had to live with the consequences. This is the Cold War's deepest legacy, the demonstration that in great power politics, most of humanity is expendable.
As you settle into the quiet of this evening, consider those who could not settle, who heard the helicopters coming, who fled through jungles and across borders, who lost everything to a conflict that was never really theirs. Their ghosts walk through the policies we debate today: immigration and intervention, development and debt, the responsibilities of powerful nations toward weaker ones. We have not reckoned with this history. It is too vast, too painful, too implicating. Easier to remember the Cold War as a contest of ideas, a battle between freedom and tyranny resolved in freedom's favor. That story is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the peripheral fires, the proxy dead, the countries wrecked so that superpowers could compete without risking themselves. In our next chapter, the temperature will change. Détente will bring a thaw, a cautious recognition by both sides that the competition might need limits. But the thaw will not stop the killing, not in Cambodia, not in Central America, not in Afghanistan. And beneath the surface, both systems will be developing cracks that no one yet sees. For now, let the distant fires fade. Let the helicopter sounds recede into memory. The Cold War is not over. It will not be over until the last of its consequences plays out, which may be never. But this chapter, at least, is done. Rest now. The world will still be broken in the morning. Tonight, that is not your burden to carry. Sleep well. Something was changing in the superpowers themselves. The certainties of the 1950s, capitalism triumphant, communism ascendant, the future belonging clearly to one side or the other, were giving way to doubt. Both systems were showing cracks. Both populations were growing weary. The question was no longer who would win the Cold War, but whether anyone would survive it. The year 1968 marked a turning point, though no one recognized it at the time. In America, cities burned after Martin Luther King's assassination. Students occupied universities. Chicago police beat protesters at the Democratic Convention. The Tet Offensive shattered faith in the Vietnam War. Robert Kennedy was murdered 2 months after King. The whole edifice of post-war American consensus seemed to be crumbling. In Europe, students took to the barricades in Paris, nearly toppling de Gaulle's government. Workers joined them. For a brief moment, revolution seemed possible again. Not communist revolution, but something else, something the old categories could not contain. The young were rejecting both superpowers, both systems, both sets of certainties. And in Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček's government was attempting socialism with a human face, reform within the Soviet bloc, democracy without abandoning communism. The Prague Spring bloomed through the summer of 1968, a beautiful, fragile moment when it seemed the Cold War's divisions might soften from within. Then, in August, Soviet tanks rolled into Prague. The Warsaw Pact crushed the reform movement. Dubček was arrested. The tanks encircled Wenceslas Square while students threw stones and Molotov cocktails, knowing it was hopeless, doing it anyway. The Prague Spring ended in occupation. The message from Moscow was clear. Reform would not be tolerated. The system would defend itself with whatever force necessary. But something had broken that could not be repaired. A generation of communists in the West, people who had defended the Soviet Union through Hungary in 1956, could not defend this. The invasion of Czechoslovakia bled away the last of the Soviet Union's moral authority among Western leftists. The myth that the Soviet system represented the future died in Prague's streets.
Richard Nixon, of all people, would become the apostle of détente. Nixon, the red baiter who had built his career on anti-communism, recognized that the Cold War's fever had to break before it killed everyone. Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor and later Secretary of State, provided the intellectual framework. They would seek not victory, but stability, not the defeat of communism, but its management. The opening to China came first. Since 1949, the United States had refused to recognize the People's Republic, maintaining the fiction that Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan represented China. This was increasingly absurd. The mainland had a quarter of humanity and nuclear weapons. It was also strategically short-sighted. China and the Soviet Union had split bitterly in the early 1960s, fighting border skirmishes, competing for leadership of the communist world. Why not exploit this division? In July 1971, Kissinger made a secret trip to Beijing. The announcement stunned the world. In February 1972, Nixon followed, the lifelong anti-communist shaking hands with Mao Zedong, toasting with Zhou Enlai, touring the Great Wall. The imagery was extraordinary. The strategic implications were greater still. The opening to China gave Nixon leverage over Moscow. If the Soviets did not negotiate seriously, the Americans could tilt toward Beijing. Détente became possible not from weakness, but from a position of triangulated strength. The Russians could not afford to be isolated from both the Americans and the Chinese. The strategic arms limitation talks began in earnest. SALT I, signed in 1972, limited the number of ballistic missile launchers each side could deploy. It did not reduce nuclear weapons. Both arsenals continued growing, but it established the principle that limits were possible, that the arms race could be constrained by negotiation rather than simply running until one side collapsed economically. Détente brought real changes, at least for a while. Trade between East and West expanded. Cultural exchanges increased. The 1975 Helsinki Accords, signed by 35 nations, recognized post-war European borders, a Soviet goal since 1945, but also committed signatories to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. This third basket of the Accords would prove unexpectedly powerful. Dissidents in Eastern Europe seized on the human rights provisions. Their governments had signed this document, had committed publicly to these principles. When those governments arrested activists or censored writers, the dissidents could point to Helsinki. You agreed to this, they said. The words were there in black and white, signed by your own leaders. Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, named for the year of its founding, used Helsinki as justification for demanding basic rights. Václav Havel, a playwright, was among its leaders. He would spend years in prison for this dissent, but the movement never died. In Poland, the Workers' Defense Committee formed in 1976 to support workers fired after strikes.
These groups were tiny, constantly harassed, seemingly powerless, but they created spaces for alternative thinking, for organizing outside official structures. They kept alive the possibility of change. In the Soviet Union itself, Andrei Sakharov, father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, hero of the state, became a dissident. He spoke out for human rights, for reform, for an end to the arms race he had helped create. The state stripped him of honors, exiled him internally to Gorky, made him a non-person, but his voice carried to the West. The physicist who had given the Soviet Union its ultimate weapon became its most prominent critic. These dissidents were not trying to overthrow their governments, not immediately. They were practicing what Havel called living in truth, refusing the lies that sustained the system, creating parallel structures of honesty and dignity alongside official corruption. It seemed quixotic, symbolic at best, but they were termites, eating away at the foundations while no one noticed. Détente did not end the proxy wars. While Nixon and Brezhnev toasted their agreements, the killing continued in Vietnam until 1975, expanded into Cambodia and Laos, created the conditions for Cambodia's genocide. While Carter preached human rights, American weapons flowed to dictators in Argentina and El Salvador and Indonesia. The contradictions were glaring. How could the United States claim to champion freedom while supporting Pinochet's Chile or Marcos's Philippines? How could it criticize Soviet repression while training torturers at the School of Americas? The answer was always the same. Anti-communism justified everything. Whatever their faults, the dictators we supported were preferable to communist alternatives. The Soviets had their own contradictions. They spoke of peace while invading Afghanistan in 1979. They criticized Western imperialism while maintaining their own empire in Eastern Europe. They proclaimed support for national liberation while crushing it whenever it threatened their interests. Both superpowers were hypocrites. Both were also sincere in their way, believing genuinely that their system represented humanity's best hope. Carter's human rights rhetoric created new pressures on both sides. He could not apply it consistently. Geopolitics prevented that, but the language itself was powerful. When the administration spoke out against repression in the Soviet Union, dissidents took heart. When the administration cut aid to particularly brutal allies, others worried they might be next. The discourse of human rights, once introduced, was hard to contain.
The 1970s brought economic troubles that shook both systems. The 1973 oil embargo demonstrated the West's vulnerability. Gas lines, inflation, unemployment, the capitalist miracle seemed to be sputtering. Stagflation, they called it, the combination of stagnant growth and rising prices that classical economics said was impossible. The post-war boom was over. The future looked grimmer. The Soviet economy faced deeper problems, though they were not yet obvious to outsiders. The system had achieved remarkable industrialization in the 1930s, rebuilt after the war's devastation, reached nuclear parity with the United States. But it had done so through massive resource mobilization, throwing labor and capital at problems rather than improving efficiency. By the 1970s, the easy gains were exhausted. Growth rates were slowing, technology was lagging, the consumer sector was a disaster. Soviet citizens queued for hours for basic goods while their government poured resources into military production. The black market and corruption were endemic. Everyone knew someone who could get things through unofficial channels. The system worked after a fashion, but it was becoming sclerotic, unable to innovate, unable to satisfy its population's rising expectations. Brezhnev's Soviet Union was stable, but it was the stability of stagnation. The leadership was aging. The ideology was hollow. No one really believed anymore. They just went through the motions. The dissidents were right. The state was sustained by lies, by the pretense that the system worked, that socialism was building paradise. The lies were becoming harder to maintain. Détente collapsed in the late 1970s. Afghanistan was the immediate cause. When the Soviets invaded in December 1979, Carter felt betrayed. The SALT II treaty, just signed, was withdrawn from Senate consideration. The 1980 Olympics in Moscow were boycotted. Détente was dead.
Ronald Reagan arrived in 1981 with a different approach. He believed the Soviet Union could be defeated, not just contained. He called it the evil empire, rejecting the moral equivalence that détente had implied. His administration launched a massive military buildup, new missiles, new bombers, the Strategic Defense Initiative that promised to render nuclear weapons obsolete through space-based defenses. SDI was probably impossible with 1980s technology. Soviet scientists knew this, but they could not afford to assume it was a bluff. They had to respond, had to pour resources into their own space defense research. The arms race, which had seemed to be winding down in the 1970s, accelerated again. The Soviet economy, already strained, bent further under the weight. In Europe, new American missiles, Pershing IIs and cruise missiles, were deployed to counter Soviet SS-20s. The peace movement erupted across Western Europe. Millions marched against the missiles. They formed human chains across countries. They camped outside military bases. The nuclear question, which had faded somewhat during détente, became urgent again. Would Europe be the battlefield if the Cold War turned hot? The early 1980s were the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Reagan's rhetoric was aggressive. Soviet paranoia was intense. They genuinely feared a Western first strike. In 1983, a NATO military exercise called Able Archer simulated procedures for nuclear release. Soviet intelligence misinterpreted the exercise as preparation for actual attack. Forces were placed on alert. Launch authorization was delegated to lower-level commanders. For days, the world balanced on the edge without knowing it. But Reagan also wanted to negotiate. For all his anti-communist rhetoric, he was horrified by nuclear weapons. He had seen classified briefings on what nuclear war would mean, the deaths, the radiation, the nuclear winter. He genuinely wanted to eliminate these weapons, not just manage them. When the right Soviet leader appeared, Reagan would be ready to deal. That leader was not ready yet. The Soviet gerontocracy had to die first. Brezhnev died in 1982. Yuri Andropov succeeded him, a former KGB chief with some reformist instincts, but he was already dying. He lasted barely a year. Konstantin Chernenko followed, another sick old man, placeholder for a system that seemed unable to renew itself. He died in March 1985. The pattern was almost comical, 3 funerals in less than 3 years. But it revealed something serious. The Soviet system had no mechanism for peaceful succession, no way to bring fresh thinking to leadership. It promoted gray functionaries who had survived decades by never questioning, never innovating, never risking. The gerontocracy was killing the state through sheer inertia. When the Politburo finally chose Mikhail Gorbachev in March 1985, they thought they were choosing a younger version of themselves, loyal, orthodox, but energetic enough to get things moving again. They were wrong. Gorbachev was 54, young for Soviet standards, and he understood that the system was dying. He believed it could be reformed, that socialism could be renewed through openness and restructuring. He was wrong about that, but his attempt to save the system would destroy it instead.
Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness, allowing discussion of problems that had been taboo. He introduced perestroika, restructuring, trying to reform the sclerotic economy. He released political prisoners. He allowed previously banned books to be published. He permitted elections with multiple candidates. Each reform was meant to strengthen the system by making it more responsive, more legitimate, more honest. Instead, glasnost revealed the full extent of the rot. Soviet citizens learned about Stalin's crimes, not just the purges, which were known, but the deliberate famines, the deportations, the scale of the Gulag. They learned about Chernobyl's cover-up, about the Afghan war's futility, about the environmental disasters the state had hidden for decades. Once the lies were exposed, nothing was left to believe in. Perestroika, meanwhile, disrupted the economy without reforming it. The old command system broke down, but market mechanisms did not replace it. Shortages worsened. The block market exploded. Miners went on strike, unthinkable in the workers' paradise. The republics began demanding autonomy, then independence.
The Soviet Union was not reforming, it was unraveling. In Eastern Europe, the impact was even more dramatic. If the Soviets were admitting their mistakes, reassessing their history, allowing open discussion, why couldn't the satellite states? Poland's solidarity movement, crushed by martial law in 1981, revived. Hungary began dismantling the barbed wire on its Austrian border. East Germans started fleeing through Hungary to the west. Gorbachev, crucially, refused to use force to hold the empire together. When the Brezhnev Doctrine, which justified Soviet intervention to preserve socialism in the bloc, was tested, Gorbachev did nothing. He let the satellites go. The tanks that crushed Hungary and Czechoslovakia stayed in their barracks. Without Soviet force backing them, the Eastern European regimes had nothing. They were hollow shells, sustained only by fear. The Cold War was ending, though few recognized it yet. The arms race continued, proxy wars raged on, but the essential dynamic was changing. The Soviet Union was exhausted, bankrupt, unable to sustain the competition. Gorbachev wanted out of the arms race, out of Afghanistan, out of the endless confrontation that was draining his country. Reagan met him in Reykjavik in October 1986. In a breathtaking discussion, they nearly agreed to eliminate all nuclear weapons. The talks broke down over SDI. Gorbachev demanded it be limited. Reagan refused. But the fact that they had even discussed total nuclear disarmament was remarkable. These were the leaders of the world's nuclear superpowers, seriously contemplating a world without the weapons that defined their rivalry. The breakthrough came in December 1987 with the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, eliminating an entire class of missiles. For the first time, nuclear weapons were not just limited, but actually reduced. Reagan and Gorbachev signed the treaty in Washington, Reagan using his famous phrase, "Trust but verify." The Russians had a saying too, "Doveryai, no proveryai." Both men smiled. The Cold War's thaw was becoming something more. As you settle into the evening's quiet, consider the strange dance of those final years. Two systems exhausted by their competition, two leaders who became partners almost despite themselves, two peoples weary of living under the shadow of annihilation. The world had been divided for so long that the division seemed permanent, natural, inevitable. But nothing is inevitable. History is made by human choices, even when those choices are constrained by forces larger than any individual. The walls are about to come down, literally, dramatically, in Berlin. But the fall, when it comes, will not be what anyone expected. Not triumph, not tragedy, but something more ambiguous, more complicated, more human. The Cold War will end not with a bang, but with confused crowds wielding hammers and champagne, tearing down a barrier they had learned to accept as eternal. But that is for our next chapter. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that even the most permanent-seeming structures can crumble, that even the deepest divisions can heal, that history does not end, but keeps unfolding in ways that surprise everyone. The Cold War taught many lessons. Perhaps the most important is this: nothing lasts forever. Not systems, not empires, not even the conflicts that define entire eras. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the walls fall. It began with candles in a church basement, Leipzig, East Germany, September 1989. A Monday evening prayer service at the Nikolaikirche, as it had been every Monday for years. A few dozen people gathering to pray for peace, for reform, for something better than the gray surveillance state they inhabited. The authorities knew about these meetings. They tolerated them, barely, because they seemed harmless. Prayer changes nothing, the state believed. The state was wrong. After the service, the congregation filed outside. Instead of dispersing, they began to walk, a silent procession through the darkened streets. 70 people, then 100, then more joining from the sidewalks. They carried candles. They sang hymns. The Stasi watched, confused. Was this a protest? It looked like a church service that had spilled into the streets. The following Monday, more came, then more. By October, 70,000 people were marching through Leipzig every Monday, chanting "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people." The candles multiplied until the city glowed with them. The Stasi prepared for a crackdown.
They had done this before, in 1953, when Soviet tanks crushed the East Berlin uprising. They knew how to handle dissent. But this time, the order never came. The tanks stayed in their barracks. Erich Honecker, East Germany's aging leader, wanted to use force. His security chiefs prepared for a Chinese solution, the term everyone used after Tiananmen Square's massacre 5 months earlier. But Gorbachev was visiting for the country's 40th anniversary. He made clear the Soviets would not back a crackdown. Life punishes those who come too late, he told Honecker. The warning was ignored, but the message reached others in the regime. On October 18th, Honecker was forced out. His replacement, Egon Krenz, promised reforms. No one believed him. The Monday demonstrations grew larger. The pressure became unbearable. The regime needed to release steam somehow to show it was responding to the people's demands, so they decided to ease travel restrictions, just a modest reform. Citizens could apply for exit visas through a bureaucratic process, hardly a revolution. The announcement was scheduled for November 9th. Günter Schabowski, a Politburo member, held a press conference that evening to explain the new regulations. He had been handed the text moments before going on television. He had not read it carefully. Near the end of the press conference, an Italian journalist asked when the new travel rules would take effect. Schabowski shuffled through his papers, searching for the answer. He found nothing specific. He mumbled something about immediately, without delay. This was wrong. The regulations were meant to begin the next day, after border guards had been briefed on procedures. But Schabowski had said immediately. The words were broadcast live across both Germanys. East Berliners heard immediately and understood it to mean the border was open. They began gathering at checkpoints, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They demanded to cross. The guards had received no orders. They called their superiors. Their superiors called their superiors. No one knew what to do. The crowd pressed forward. At the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, the commander faced an impossible situation. Thousands of East Berliners chanting, demanding passage. His orders said to stop them. But how? He could not shoot thousands of people. That would be a massacre, and Gorbachev had made clear Moscow would not support such methods. At 11:30 p.m., overwhelmed and unauthorized, he opened the gate. The crowd surged through. East Berliners poured into West Berlin. Strangers embraced them, crying, laughing, offering champagne and flowers. Others climbed onto the wall itself, dancing on the barrier that had divided the city for 28 years. Someone produced a hammer and began chipping at the concrete. Others joined. By morning, the wall was being demolished piece by ordinary citizens with whatever tools they could find. The images went around the world instantly. The Berlin Wall, the Cold War's most powerful symbol, was coming down not by treaty or negotiation, but by spontaneous popular action. East Germans who had grown up knowing the wall as permanent, as unchangeable as geography, were destroying it with sledgehammers and pickaxes and bare hands. The Cold War's most enduring icon was reduced to rubble and souvenirs. But Berlin was only the most dramatic moment in a cascade that had been building for months. The Iron Curtain was unraveling across Eastern Europe, each country following its own path, but all moving in the same direction, away from communism, away from Soviet control, towards something they hoped would be better.
Poland had moved first, in a sense. Solidarity, the workers' movement crushed by martial law in 1981, had never entirely died. It survived underground, supported by the Catholic Church and Western aid. By 1988, with the economy collapsing and strikes spreading, the regime had no choice but to negotiate. Roundtable talks began in February 1989. The result was an agreement for partially free elections in June. The elections were meant to be controlled. The communists would retain majority power. Solidarity could have some seats, enough to co-opt them into the system. Instead, Solidarity won every seat it was allowed to contest. The results were a humiliation for the regime. By August, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a Solidarity activist, became prime minister, the first non-communist leader in the Eastern Bloc since the 1940s. Hungary moved quietly but decisively.
Reformers within the Communist Party itself pushed for change. In May 1989, Hungary began dismantling the barbed wire fence along its Austrian border. This was presented as a technical matter, a symbolic gesture toward openness. Its real significance became clear in August, when thousands of East Germans vacationing in Hungary fled across the Austrian border. They were voting with their feet, abandoning a state that claimed to represent workers' interests. The East German regime protested. Hungary ignored them. Gorbachev did nothing. The message was unmistakable. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. The Soviets would not intervene to preserve the satellite regimes. Those regimes were on their own. Czechoslovakia's revolution came last and most beautifully. The Velvet Revolution, they called it, for its gentleness, its lack of violence. It began on November 17th with a student demonstration in Prague, officially sanctioned to commemorate a student killed by the Nazis. But the students did not stop at the designated area. They marched toward Wenceslas Square. Police attacked them brutally, beating students bloody in the streets. The violence backfired spectacularly. Prague erupted in protest. Students went on strike. Workers joined them. Every day, hundreds of thousands gathered in Wenceslas Square, jangling their keys, the signal that it was time for the regime to go. Václav Havel, the dissident playwright who had spent years in prison, emerged as the movement's spokesman. The regime had no response. They could not shoot, not after the world had watched the Berlin Wall fall. They could not compromise. The people were demanding their complete removal. On November 24th, the entire Politburo resigned. By December, Havel was president. The transformation from prisoner to president took weeks. The communist regime that had ruled since 1948 simply dissolved, unable to justify its existence once fear no longer sustained it. Bulgaria followed. East Germany followed. Even Romania, the most repressive regime in the bloc, fell, though there the revolution turned violent. Ceausescu, the dictator who had ruled for 24 years, ordered his security forces to shoot protesters. They did, killing hundreds. But the army switched sides. Ceausescu and his wife fled, were captured, and on Christmas Day 1989 were executed by firing squad after a summary trial. The footage was broadcast on Romanian television. The couple who had lived in absurd luxury while their people starved, who had demolished villages and built palaces, died against a wall. It was brutal, unjust by any legal standard, but also somehow fitting. A regime that had ruled by fear ended in fear, the dictator receiving the same rough justice he had dispensed for decades.
By the end of 1989, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe had ceased to exist. Not a single communist regime survived the year. It had happened with stunning speed. The structures that seemed permanent in January were gone by December. Historians would debate the causes for decades, but one fact was undeniable. When people lost their fear, the regimes had nothing left. The Soviet Union itself was next. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, began demanding independence. They had been annexed in 1940, absorbed into the Soviet Union against their will. Now they wanted out. Lithuania declared independence in March 1990. Gorbachev tried to preserve the Union through compromise and negotiation. It was too late. The logic of reform had become the logic of dissolution. Hardliners within the Soviet system watched in horror. Gorbachev was destroying everything they had spent their lives building. In August 1991, they struck. A coup announced while Gorbachev vacationed in Crimea. Tanks rolled into Moscow. The plotters declared emergency rule, promising to restore order and preserve the Soviet Union. They failed within days. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament building and defied the coup. Crowds gathered to defend the parliament. Soldiers refused to shoot. The coup plotters, old men accustomed to a system where orders were always obeyed, discovered that authority without legitimacy is powerless. They surrendered. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his power was broken.
The final months were a formality. The republics declared independence one after another. Ukraine, Belarus, the Central Asian states, all gone. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of a state that no longer existed. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor rose in its place. 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union dissolved without a shot fired. The Cold War's loser had lost so completely it had ceased to exist. The West celebrated. The victory of freedom over tyranny, they called it. Francis Fukuyama wrote, "The end of history. Liberal democracy had won permanently. There would be no more ideological contestation. Capitalism and democracy would spread across the globe. The future was settled." The triumphalism was understandable but premature. Yes, the Soviet system had failed. Yes, communism, as practiced in the 20th century, had produced repression and poverty. But the Cold War's end did not vindicate everything the West had done in its name. The dictators supported, the democracies overthrown, the wars fought in the periphery, these did not become retroactively justified. And the transition from communism was not the smooth path to prosperity that Westerners imagined. Shock therapy economics, rapid privatization, immediate market liberalization produced devastation across the former Soviet bloc. State assets were sold at fire sale prices to insiders who became oligarchs overnight. Social safety nets disappeared. Life expectancy dropped. The 1990s in Russia were a time of chaos and humiliation that would have profound political consequences. But in that moment, in late 1989 and through 1991, there was genuine joy. The fear that had defined life in Eastern Europe for 2 generations lifted. People could speak freely, travel freely, read banned books, watch forbidden films. They could vote in real elections where the outcome was not predetermined. The relief was palpable, the sense of possibility intoxicating. In Berlin, they held a concert at the Wall on New Year's Eve 1989. Leonard Bernstein conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, changing Schiller's text from Ode to Joy to Ode to Freedom. The performance brought together musicians from both East and West, from all 4 occupying powers. Bernstein was old and sick. He would die the next year, but he led with fierce joy. When the chorus sang Freiheit, freedom, the crowd wept.
What had ended the Cold War? Historians offer different answers. Some credit Reagan's military buildup, arguing it bankrupted the Soviet Union, forced it into collapse. Some credit Gorbachev's reforms, which unleashed forces that could not be controlled. Some credit the dissidents, the Monday Marchers, the people who refused to live by lies even when it cost them everything. Perhaps all these explanations are true. The Soviet system was economically exhausted. Reagan's arms race accelerated the crisis. Gorbachev tried to reform the unreformable. And popular resistance, which had seemed quixotic for decades, suddenly found the moment when the regime could no longer respond with violence. Or perhaps the answer is simpler. The Soviet system fell because no one believed in it anymore. Not the leaders, not the bureaucrats, not the people. It persisted through inertia and fear, but when the fear lifted, there was nothing underneath. The emperor had no clothes, and once someone said it aloud, everyone could see. The American system survived, but it was not unchanged. The Cold War had shaped American society profoundly. The military-industrial complex, the national security state, the sense of global mission. These did not disappear when the Soviet Union did. They persisted, looking for new enemies, new justifications, new threats to contain. The Cold War's end was not the end of history. It was not even the end of the Cold War's legacy. The structures built to fight that conflict, the habits of mind it created, the unresolved contradictions it papered over, all of these persisted into the new era. The ghosts of the Cold War still walk among us, shaping our politics in ways we do not always recognize. As you drift towards sleep, imagine November 9th, 1989 from the perspective of someone who had known the wall their entire life. You are East German, born after the wall went up in 1961. You have never known a world where Berlin was not divided. You have absorbed the division as natural, permanent, unchangeable.
And then, in a single night, it ends. Not through war or diplomacy, but through confusion and accident and crowds of ordinary people who decided they had waited long enough. You walk through the checkpoint that would have shot you yesterday. You stand in West Berlin, drinking champagne a stranger hands you, crying without quite knowing why. The world has changed utterly, and you are not sure what comes next. The system you hated is gone, but it was the only system you knew. The future is open, which is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. You are free, but you do not yet know what that freedom means. That feeling, that mixture of joy and uncertainty, liberation and loss, captures something essential about the Cold War's end. Victory, yes, but victory over what? Freedom, yes, but freedom for what? The questions that the Cold War had deferred, the problems it had papered over with ideological certainty, all of these persisted into the new era. The ghosts of the Cold War still walk among us, shaping our politics in ways we do not always recognize. In our final chapter, we will trace the Cold War's shadows into our present moment. We will see how the world we inherited, the politics we practice, the fears we harbor, all bear the imprint of that long, strange conflict. The walls came down, the empire dissolved, but the Cold War, in some essential sense, never ended. It changed form, mutated, adapted, and it is with us still. For tonight, rest in the knowledge that change is possible. Systems that seem eternal can crumble. Walls that seem permanent can fall. Tomorrow is not guaranteed to be better than today, but it is not guaranteed to be worse either. History remains open, still being written, still subject to human action and human choice. Sleep well. The Cold War is over, mostly. What comes next is still being determined.
The Cold War ended, but its children are still in charge. Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer in Dresden when the Berlin Wall fell, watching helplessly as the empire he served disintegrated. Joe Biden entered the Senate in 1973, his entire political career shaped by the bipolar world. Xi Jinping came of age during the Cultural Revolution and Mao's final years, when China defined itself against both superpowers. The leaders who shape our world today were all forged in the Cold War's crucible. They learned its lessons, though not always the right ones. Tonight, as we close this journey through the conflict that made our modern world, we trace the shadows that persist. Some are obvious. Nuclear weapons still exist, the arsenal's smaller but still capable of ending civilization. Some are subtle. The habits of mind, the reflexive divisions, the tendency to see the world in binary terms. And some are returning in new forms, a Cold War 2.0 they call it, though the players and stakes are different now. The story of how the Cold War ended matters less than the story of what happened next, because the end of that conflict unleashed forces that no one fully anticipated, created power vacuums that were filled in unexpected ways, and left behind populations nursing grievances that would shape the politics of decades to come. This is not ancient history. This is the world you woke up in this morning. Russia's humiliation in the 1990s cannot be overstated. A superpower that had rivaled America, that had put the first human in space, that had defeated Napoleon and Hitler, was reduced to begging the IMF for loans. The economy collapsed. Pensioners went unpaid. The military rusted. Soldiers sold their weapons for food. The state could barely function. Westerners, secure in their own prosperity, often treated this as natural and deserved. Russia had lost the Cold War, of course it would suffer. Shock therapy economics, the rapid privatization of state industries, was presented as the only path forward. Follow the Washington Consensus, we told them. Embrace the market. Democracy and prosperity will follow. Instead came oligarchy and chaos. State assets were sold for pennies on the dollar to insiders with the right connections. A tiny class of men became unimaginably wealthy, while the majority saw their savings evaporate, their jobs disappear, their social safety net shredded. Life expectancy for Russian men dropped dramatically, a peacetime demographic collapse unprecedented in the developed world.
The West's answer was more of the same: more privatization, more austerity, more lectures about the free market. When Russians protested that they were being destroyed, Western economists dismissed their concerns. This was the painful but necessary transition from communism to capitalism. They would thank us later. They did not thank us. They elected Putin.
Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999, promising to restore Russia's dignity. He was a product of the security services, a man who had watched the Soviet collapse and learned one lesson: weakness invites humiliation. Strong states command respect. Weak states are dismembered. He stabilized the economy, helped by rising oil prices. He crushed the Chechen rebellion with brutal efficiency. He brought the oligarchs to heel. They could keep their wealth if they stayed out of politics. He rebuilt the military, and he began pushing back against what he saw as Western encirclement. NATO's expansion eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact members and even former Soviet republics, was seen in Russia as betrayal. Western leaders claimed they had never promised not to expand NATO, though the documentary record is ambiguous. Russians believed they had been promised and then deceived, that the West had taken advantage of Russian weakness in the 1990s to lock in permanent strategic advantage. From the Western perspective, NATO expansion was about allowing sovereign nations to choose their own alliances. Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, these countries wanted NATO membership because they feared Russia. Given their history, who could blame them? NATO was defensive. Russia had no legitimate grounds for complaint. From the Russian perspective, NATO expansion was aggressive encirclement. Imagine, Putin asked, if Russia had formed a military alliance with Mexico and Canada. Would Americans consider that defensive? The logic of security is always relative. What looks defensive from one side looks threatening from the other. This fundamental disagreement over the post-Cold War order has shaped everything that followed. The 2008 war in Georgia, Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and intervention in eastern Ukraine, the 2022 full-scale invasion, all of these emerged from Putin's determination to resist what he saw as Western attempts to bring Ukraine into the Western sphere and ultimately into NATO. The tragedy is that both sides' fears are somewhat justified. Russia's neighbors have good reason to fear Russian power. They remember the occupations, the deportations, the crushing of their independence. Russia has some reason to fear NATO expansion. Powers do worry about hostile military alliances on their borders, whatever the alliance's stated intentions. But acknowledging complexity does not mean accepting false equivalence. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal, unjustified, a war of choice that has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions. The sovereignty of nations matters. The principle that borders should not be changed by force matters. Putin's grievances, even if partly legitimate, do not justify the war he has launched. Yet the Cold War's shadow hangs over it all. The language of spheres of influence, the instinct toward military solutions, the tendency to see every issue through the lens of great power competition, these are Cold War inheritances. We have not escaped that mental architecture. We have simply painted it in new colors. Russia's war in Ukraine has revived Cold War dynamics in Europe that many thought were buried forever. Finland and Sweden, neutral throughout the original Cold War, have joined NATO. Germany is rearming. Defense spending is rising across Europe. The continent is divided again, if not by an iron curtain, then by a border marked in blood and trenches. And the nuclear threat, which had receded into background noise for a generation, has returned to active consciousness. Putin's veiled threats about nuclear escalation have reminded everyone that these weapons still exist, that their use remains thinkable, that we are still living under the shadow of potential annihilation.
Meanwhile, America has its own Cold War ghosts to confront. The national security state built to fight the Soviet Union did not dismantle when the Soviet Union dissolved. It simply found new enemies. The war on terror became the new organizing principle. Al-Qaeda replaced the Soviet Union as the existential threat.
The authorization for use of military force, passed 3 days after September 11, 2001, has been used to justify military operations in at least 19 countries over more than 2 decades. The forever wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, the diffuse interventions across the Middle East and Africa, these are Cold War habits applied to a post-Cold War world. The results have been mixed at best. Afghanistan, where America spent 20 years and over $2 trillion, fell to the Taliban within weeks of the final withdrawal. Iraq's invasion was sold on false pretenses about weapons of mass destruction, produced a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands, and created the conditions for ISIS to emerge. Libya's intervention removed Gaddafi but produced a failed state in a new hub for human trafficking and terrorism. The pattern repeats the Cold War's peripheral conflicts: intervention based on overestimated threats and overconfidence in military solutions, initial success followed by quagmire, local populations paying the highest price, ultimate outcomes that make the original problem worse. The domestic consequences echo the Cold War too. The surveillance state expanded dramatically after 9/11. The Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping, the massive data collection revealed by Edward Snowden, all justified by security needs, all eroding the civil liberties they were meant to protect. The FISA courts operate in secret. Drone strikes kill American citizens without trial. Guantanamo Bay remains open 20 years later, its detainees in legal limbo. We have not had a McCarthyism, quite, but we have had moments that rhyme. Muslims faced discrimination and surveillance after 9/11. Dissent from the War on Terror's consensus was treated as near treasonous, especially in the Bush years. The instinct to sacrifice liberty for security, to see threats everywhere, to divide the world into those with us and against us, these are Cold War reflexes that never fully faded. And now there is China. The new Cold War analysts call the emerging US-China competition. The parallels are obvious: two great powers with incompatible systems competing for global influence, locked in technological and military rivalry. But the differences matter too. China is not the Soviet Union. Its economy is vibrant, not sclerotic. It is deeply integrated into the global trading system, not isolated from it. Its model, authoritarian politics combined with market economics, has proven more durable and appealing to developing countries than Soviet-style communism ever was. The competition with China is real. Beijing's treatment of Uyghurs and Xinjiang is genocidal. Its crushing of Hong Kong's freedoms violated its international commitments. Its militarization of the South China Sea threatens its neighbors. Its support for Russia's war in Ukraine undermines the international order. These are genuine concerns requiring serious response.
But the Cold War framework is dangerous when applied uncritically to China. The Soviet Union and the United States traded almost nothing. Their economies were separate. China and America are economically intertwined. Your phone, your computer, many of your clothes and household goods were made in China or contain Chinese components. Decoupling, if it were even possible, would devastate both economies and the world economy with them. Moreover, the challenges humanity faces, climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, require cooperation between the world's largest powers. A new Cold War with its zero-sum logic and its demand for alignment makes solving these problems almost impossible. We cannot afford another 45 years of great power confrontation when the planet is burning and the weapons keep getting deadlier. Yet the drift toward Cold War 2.0 continues. Each side sees the other as the aggressor. Each side's military preparations are defensive from its own perspective, threatening from the others. The logic of security dilemma, where steps taken to increase one's own security decrease the others, prompting countermeasures that leave both less secure, is reasserting itself. Taiwan is the flashpoint, the issue that could trigger war between nuclear powers. China considers Taiwan part of China, to be reunited eventually, by force if necessary. The United States has committed, ambiguously but seriously, to Taiwan's defense. The ambiguity is intentional.
strategic ambiguity, they call it, meant to deter both Chinese invasion and Taiwanese declaration of independence. But ambiguity in crisis is dangerous. Misunderstandings escalate. Red lines get crossed by accident. Wars no one wanted begin. The Cold War also left us with nuclear weapons, thousands of them, on missiles that can launch in minutes. The arsenals are smaller than they were, down from Cold War peaks of over 60,000 warheads to around 13,000 today. But 13,000 is still enough to end civilization multiple times over. Overkill remains kill. The infrastructure is aging. The officers who manage the systems are sometimes found asleep on duty or caught cheating on competency tests. There have been false alarms, close calls, moments when we came closer to accidental nuclear war than the public knew. In 1995, a Russian early warning system detected what looked like a submarine-launched nuclear missile heading for Moscow. It was actually a Norwegian research rocket. Russian officers had minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. They waited. The rocket flew out of range. The world went on, unaware how close it had come. The treaties that regulated the nuclear balance are collapsing. The INF Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of missiles, died in 2019. New START, which limits strategic weapons, was extended in 2021, but expires in 2026. There is no indication that Russia or the United States is interested in negotiating its replacement. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal and refuses to be bound by arms control agreements. We are sliding back toward an unregulated nuclear arms race. New technologies, hypersonic missiles, autonomous weapons systems, cyber attacks on command and control are making the nuclear balance more unstable and unpredictable. The Cold War's most dangerous legacy is coming back to haunt us, and we seem determined to ignore it until it is too late.
Beyond geopolitics, the Cold War left us with habits of mind that distort our politics. The tendency to see the world in binary terms, freedom versus tyranny, good versus evil, us versus them. The assumption that complex problems have simple solutions if only we apply enough force or enough money. The belief that America has a special role to play in the world, a mission to spread democracy and defend freedom. These ideas are not entirely wrong. The world does contain genuine tyrannies. Democracy is better than authoritarianism. America has sometimes used its power for good. But the simplicity is the problem. The Cold War taught us to flatten complexity into moral clarity, to ignore context and history and legitimate grievances, to see every struggle through the lens of our own preoccupations. This produces bad policy and worse outcomes. Iraq was not Nazi Germany. Removing Saddam did not produce democracy. Afghanistan was not a domino that would topple others if it fell to the Taliban. Nation-building failed because nations cannot be built by foreigners. Libya's intervention removed a dictator but produced a failed state worse than what preceded it. The Cold War also left us with permanent militarization. Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. The warning went unheeded. Defense contractors have become immensely powerful, with enormous lobbying operations and factories strategically located in congressional districts across the country. The Pentagon budget grows almost regardless of threats, absorbing resources that might address poverty, education, infrastructure, healthcare. America spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. This is not because America faces threats 10 times greater than anyone else. It is because the Cold War normalized permanent military mobilization, and the interests that benefit from that mobilization are powerful enough to sustain it indefinitely. But perhaps the deepest Cold War legacy is the loss of imagination. For 2 generations, the world was divided between 2 models, Soviet communism and American capitalism. The contest was presented as total, not just which system was better, but which was possible. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the victors declared that history had ended, that liberal democracy and free markets were the final form of human social organization. This was always nonsense. History does not end. Capitalism and democracy, for all their virtues, have profound problems.
Inequality is rising to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Climate change threatens civilization itself. Democracy is eroding even in its heartlands. Technological change is eliminating jobs faster than new ones are created. The social contract is fraying. We need new thinking, new models, new approaches. But the Cold War taught us that there was only one alternative to the status quo, and that alternative failed catastrophically. So we are trapped, unable to imagine beyond the system we have, even as that system produces outcomes that are clearly unsustainable. The young feel this acutely. They have inherited a world where housing is unaffordable, education saddles them with debt, work is precarious, and the climate is collapsing. When they suggest alternatives, stronger social safety nets, wealth redistribution, public ownership of essential services, they are told these ideas failed in the Soviet Union. The Cold War, decades after its end, still polices the boundaries of acceptable thought. But the Soviet Union's failure does not vindicate unfettered capitalism any more than capitalism's problems vindicate Soviet communism. These were not the only two options. They are not the only two options now. The world is vast, and human creativity inexhaustible. We can imagine other ways of organizing society, other distributions of wealth and power, other relationships between individuals and communities and the state. The Cold War's deepest damage may be that it convinced us we could not.
So where does this leave us, here at the end of our journey through the conflict that shaped the modern world? The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The Berlin Wall exists only in museums and memory. But the world the Cold War made is still very much with us. We live with its weapons, still on alert, still capable of ending everything. We live with its divisions, updated for new players but following old scripts. We live with its habits, the militarization, the secrecy, the tendency to see enemies everywhere. We live with its failures of imagination, unable to think beyond the binary it imposed. But we also live with its lessons, if we choose to learn them. The Cold War showed that even the most permanent-seeming structures can collapse, that popular movements can topple regimes that seemed invulnerable, that fear is a poor foundation for any system, that arms races benefit no one, that proxy wars kill millions while solving nothing, that ideological certainty is dangerous, that the planet cannot afford great power conflict in the nuclear age. The question is whether we will learn these lessons or repeat the Cold War's mistakes with new adversaries and new weapons. The early signs are not encouraging. The drift toward Cold War 2.0 with China, the nuclear saber rattling over Ukraine, the forever wars that never quite end, these suggest we have learned little. But history is not deterministic. The future is not written. The choices we make about how to engage with China, about nuclear weapons, about military spending, about the kind of world we want to build, will determine whether the Cold War's shadows lengthen or finally fade. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider what you want to carry forward from the Cold War and what you want to leave behind. The courage of the dissidents who spoke truth to power, carry that forward. The Monday Marchers in Leipzig, the Charter 77 signatories, the Solidarity Workers, they showed that ordinary people can change history. Learn from them. The militarization, the proxy wars, the nuclear brinkmanship, leave those behind. They did not keep us safe. They made the world more dangerous and wasted resources that could have been spent making life better. The binary thinking, the demand for ideological purity, the inability to imagine alternatives, leave those behind too. The world is complex. Simple answers are usually wrong. Disagreement is not treachery. Criticism is not betrayal. Democracy requires the ability to live with ambiguity and accommodate difference. The Cold War is history now, studied in books, remembered by fewer people each year. But its children are still in charge, and its assumptions still shape our politics.
Breaking free requires conscious effort, deliberate choice, the courage to imagine beyond the categories it imposed. The walls came down in 1989, but the walls in our minds, the Cold War's most enduring architecture, those we have to dismantle ourselves. No crowd with hammers will do it for us. It is quieter work, harder work, the work of questioning assumptions and examining inherited certainties and being willing to think differently. That work continues. It is, in some sense, the work of democracy itself, the never-ending task of reimagining and rebuilding our common life. The Cold War tried to end history, to declare that one side had won permanently and no further thinking was required. But history cannot end while human beings are still alive, still struggling, still hoping for something better. So sleep now, knowing that the story continues. The Cold War shaped our world, but it does not have to determine our future. That future is still being written, and you, whether you know it or not, whether you choose it or not, are one of its authors. Tomorrow, when you wake, the shadows will still be there. But shadows exist only because there is light, and the light, despite everything, persists. Sleep well. The long twilight struggle is over. What comes next is up to us.